We want to be up close to that.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for part 2 of our program, From Hatred to Holiness and Back, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the Desert and Or Hamidbar. I'd like to re-thank Rabbi David Lazar and Father Andrew Green for lending us their expertise and agreeing to discuss such an important topic. Some housekeeping for today. Questions may be typed to panelists in a Q&A box, and this session is also being recorded. With that, I give you 2 experts, Rabbi David Lazar and Father Green. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to continue in some ways where we began last week, but that being said, today is separate. You could understand it on its own. We're looking at problematic, challenging texts from the New Testament from an anti-Semitic point of view. Today, we're going to see that the love, or I should say the hatred, is not exclusive towards us, as we'll see in just a moment with a character that we met last week from the internet. But for now, I'll say that this particular passage that we're going to look at today of Matthew 12 is a passage that comes up quite a bit, and it's called the 7 Woes. Would you like to say a few words about the passage before we actually get to it?
The passage is one that from Matthew that we use liturgically once every 3 years, and it is perhaps most well known by people because of its multiple use of hypocrites. And so hypocrites is perhaps one of the catchphrases that the average Christian would use to apply to religious leaders of Jesus' time. And other people have learned to translate that out as all Jews are hypocrites.
Okay. As I used to like to say with working with teenagers, the word hypocrite is a strong word. I used to try to encourage them to say maybe inconsistent. It turns out that there's quite a bit of scholarship as well on the word hypocrite, and basically it's a Greek word. Translating a word in English with the Greek is always a problematic thing. But right now, I guess we'll say maybe we agree, Andrew, that it's something's off. It's not, the pieces don't fit together. Something's off, inconsistent.
Yes.
Okay. Well, let's take a look and see what we've got prepared today for our colorful slideshow. And I'd like to thank Madalena Garza, who, as usual, as always, helps us with the tech aspects, the beautiful graphics and things. And let's see where we go. Here we are. I would say it's our friend, Stephen Anderson, but when I say friend, I'm saying it in quotation marks. Here he is, seems to be rather present or omnipresent on the internet. Let's take a look and listen to what he has to say today.
Hey everybody, Pastor Stephen Anderson here from Faithful Word Baptist Church in Tempe, Arizona, with another Trinity moment, proving that the Trinity is biblical and that oneness or modalism is a lie. Matthew chapter 23 verse 9 reads, "And call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven." This is Jesus Christ speaking, saying, one is your Father which is in heaven. Call no man your father upon the earth. And of course, this is a verse that we use a lot to refute the Catholic priests calling themselves father. He says, don't be called rabbi or master or father. We see a lot of false religions using those 3 terms today, master, rabbi, or father. But consistently in the Bible, the Father is described as being in heaven. It's our Father which art in heaven. One is your Father which is in heaven. The Father, God the Father, was not on earth dwelling among men. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was dwelling on earth among men. And so the Trinity has it right again. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, 3 persons, 1 God. Jesus is God, but he's not God the Father. He's God the Son. He's the Son of God. And so consistently, we see the Father as being described in heaven. Now, Jesus said, I'm in the Father is in me. Obviously, no man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. But Jesus Christ is not God the Father. He's not his own Father. He's the Son of God. And the Father is consistently in heaven.
Wow, after listening to that, I don't know why everybody hasn't just jumped on board.
Well, I think he uses the word consistently quite a bit. He's
Yes.
consistent in his usage. I think what's most consistent about this, Mr. Anderson, is his lack of love for other viewpoints. And we could not really call him a pluralist. So Andrew, I sprung this on you. I wanted to see your reaction. I only saw this, I only found this last night. So you haven't seen this. What are your initial reactions? Father Andrew.
Father Andrew, yes. Well, I mean, my initial reactions are one to start laughing out loud because it's an argument that assumes that philosophical and religious complexity can be solved by just saying, well, it is, and there's no logic to what he has to say. And if I were a person who had never heard of the Trinity and I heard him describing it, it would not be convincing to me to jump on board his ship. So I find him laughably humorous. The sad part is that he probably has a few hundred people or more, maybe even 1,000 or more in his church, and I think that's very sad.
And we don't know to what extent this particular view is out there in certain circles, right? I don't think we hear it locally so much here at Palm Springs.
Well, I'd suggest that anybody that goes out and decides that they're going to make talking in an authoritative way about the Trinity, I think they're going to find themselves stuck. Some of the greatest thinkers of the church fathers, one of them talked about when it comes to talking about the Trinity, we should simply keep silence. And frankly, I think that there's times when that is the way that one talks about a mystery. You don't act like the mystery is the same as telling somebody how to dial their cell phone.
But for today, we're actually not going to deal with the Trinity. That is something for the future, a really interesting conversation between a father and a rabbi about how we think of that and whether that is idolatrous in the eyes of traditional Judaism or not, another day. But I wanted to use that as an example of how this text that Andrew is going to begin to read for us now from Matthew 12, how it can be used, misused, where it came from, much to what we did last week. How do we react to this particular challenging text in the New Testament?
Hey, everybody, Pat.
Go ahead, if you will.
Okay, so this particular passage is read in the year in which Matthew is the gospel for most of our Eucharistic, our worship services on Sundays. And that's this year, and that will come up probably the first week in November, potentially. So I'm going to be reading from, I believe it's a New Revised Standard Version. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do. For they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, and all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted."
So before I ask perhaps some of your comments, I want to give some of the Jewish background to this rather Jewish Jewishly oriented gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. And one is this thing called Moses' seat. Well, it turns out there really was such a thing called Moses' seat, Cathedra de Moshe, Cathedra de Moshe, which is Aramaic, which is actually a word from Greek, cathedra, as is the word for cathedral, right? And there is archaeological evidence from the land of Israel, one from Hamat near Tiberias. Can't remember the other place right now. And there is a particular chair that is pretty agreed upon already now for, I don't know, 60, 70 years, maybe even more, that is this particular chair of Moses, which is referred to a little bit in rabbinic literature as well. But more importantly, in archaeological evidence, there are benches along the eastern, well, not the eastern, the side of the synagogue that faces Jerusalem. It could be the southern, it could be the northern, but most of the synagogues are in the northern part of Israel that I know about are excavated. And there's a bench along the wall where the dignitaries would sit, much like you have today in a synagogue where maybe the rabbi, the cantor, the president, a board member sits, maybe the Torah reader for those that are familiar with the synagogue world, or similarly in the church world where the priest or whoever's the officiant and the deacons might sit, and the choir as well. Right. So those are places of honor. All right, up on the dais, we'd say. So that's in the background, the Jewish background of realia of this particular passage. The other one is phylacteries and fringes. Phylacteries in Hebrew or Aramaic, tefillin. They are boxes made out of leather that go on the arm and between the eyes. It's from, there are 4 passages, 2 from Exodus, 2 from Deuteronomy, that talk about this particular practice, this ritualistic practice. In ancient times, men would wear them the entire day, not at night, but in the day, as long as they were in a clean place. They would study, they would pray. With time, it became something you just put on, you may know from the prayer service here, on the, as a sign on your forearm and between your eyes. And those are phylacteries. To make them broad is, although there's a lot of discussion amongst commentators, does it mean the straps themselves? Does it mean the boxes? I think it's you making them large, making them big, to say, look what a tzaddik I am, look what a righteous person I am. Or I've got long fringes as well. That's the tzitzit that attached to a talit, if you're familiar with the piece of clothing, or for very traditional people wearing an undergarment that has the 4 corners that's talked about in the book of Numbers. The idea is that it's not that you don't do them, but you do them in such, I understand, a pronounced way to show how righteous you are. And we already had a comment about the different titles. I will say that one of my Christian friends in Texas, I was once visiting their town, and my daughter came along and she was calling me Abba. And this woman just thought it was so fascinating that she would call me Abba, because in her tradition, Abba was our Father in heaven, right? That's the Abba. Abba, of course, is the familiar Hebrew term for father. Rav, which is rabbi in Hebrew. Rabbi is Rav and Rabbi. Rabbi was the Palestinian Aramaic Palestinian title. In Babylonia, it was Rav. That means master. So here we have the background, some of the background for this passage. Andrew.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think, even the English, this person who had the video was Stephen, Pastor Stephen, was not even really familiar with English, because master, most of us men get the title of Mr., which is simply is master and put in a particular form for everyone. And so the idea is everyone's a master. So I find that working through all of this is, again, kind of humorous, because the ideas behind this are that there's a part that I remembered studying for last week, and the idea is that this was not something that Christians found Jews, if one could do that at that time, and would go and find them and would berate them with these words. These were words that Christians did with one another, because they were criticizing the behaviors, the ritual the piety of the various groups of Christians. And I believe we'll find that various groups of Jewish followers would do the same sort of things amongst their opponents, of the people jockeying for a particular position. Is it time for me to go with the scholar who's?
Yeah, well, let's actually, that comes a little bit later.
Okay.
We're gonna, I think we'll finish the text
Finish the
first,
text.
but let's
So-
go on.
Down to 13 through
Skipping a
15.
little bit. We kind of brought you the greatest hits of this passage.
Yes. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, or away with you, pettifogging Pharisee lawyers. For you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves.
Just to comment about the Pharisees and the pettifogging, I think it was Albright, in Albright's commentary, he goes on about it. Hypocrites doesn't mean the same, it's just translating the same word. So he gives us this lovely word called pettifogging, which I admit I don't think I've ever seen before in my life.
I mean, it's kind of a colloquial term from what, 19th century English. And it's about somebody who's kind of puffed up.
Okay, all right. And what do you make of the ending here, a child of hell as yourselves?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it is the ultimate in letting someone know that they are on the wrong pathway. And so they're working really hard, but the result of their work is that they're ending up in the opposite of their goal, and that not only are they in bad shape, but everyone whom they're trying to convert and to convince, they're putting them in even worse shape. So I would suggest this is not someone who is really trying to give positive, constructive criticism to these Pharisees, but is writing them off completely.
So one thing we don't want to miss out here is that there is this back and forth. It seems to be in the air here, an accusation of recruiting, of converting. And some Jews might feel that they were brought up knowing that Jews don't do that, don't proselytize. Well, that actually is not true. There were certain periods of time in which proselytization was extremely, extremely aggressive. I'm thinking now of Tadmor of Palmyra, a whole nation that was force converted by the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. It also goes to show that there were views out there, this passage in the first century of the Common Era, in which Jews did that. In the end, the Pharisaic-based rabbis of the Talmud went with, we don't proselytize, right? And that's kind of how it went. And then other things grew to almost have people shun converts in some circles, Jewish circles. But that's in the background here. But that expression, I think we had it last week, did we not, from John, children of hell?
Well, we had the synagogue of Satan.
Synagogue of Satan. I think we maybe looked at another one. Since then, I was in a different study, I saw the biblical term B'nai Belial came up. It's a few dozen times in Hebrew Bible, maybe 30 or 40 times, I think. B'nai Belial, literally the children of Belial. And it means in the context, these good-for-nothings, these gang types, thugs, it has different meanings like that. But rabbinic interpretation parse the word literally. Belial, they parse into two words. Bli means without. And according to one rabbinic view, it's bli ol, without yoke. They're yokeless people, right? They don't have discipline, right? The other one was, and that's pertinent to here, bli ya'alu, without coming up from three dots. And we understand from that, from Sheol, from the underworld, from the predecessor or the precursor of hell, what became Gehenna.
Well, I guess, yeah, the thing for me is that the idea of Gehenna is Christians in particular mush all these things together. We've got, from Jewish philosophy, we've got Hades. And in fact, even in some of our creeds, up until the last century, we used Hades in the place of the word. It was converted to hell and so it means a place of the dead rather than a place of punishment. And even hell, as in this passage, is a translation of Gehenna, which is a location.
Right, Gehinnom or
Gehinnom, and it has nothing to do with a place of punishment, but a place where people who were not Jews would be buried.
Very possibly in the time of Jesus.
Yeah.
Also the place that was known to be, or was thought to be, whether it's historically correct or not, but it was to have the reputation of being where the children were sacrificed to Molech, at least in certain circles. It was a place of the subtitles of your screen on Netflix would say ominous music. It was one of those places.
Yes.
Okay, so let's take a look onward, going onward a little bit.
One more.
Another of the greatest hits that at least in my
I think this is
opinion.
the last one of these,
Yeah.
I think. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel.
Colorful, which is why I picked this particular one as a highlight. What is tithing? In biblical law, one needs to tithe. There's a tithe according to the priestly code. There's a tithe according to Deuteronomy, but it was a tenth of the crop. In some cases, according to some views in the Torah, 5 books of Moses, it went to the Levites. According to others, it went to the poor people or was to be eaten in Jerusalem, depending on the year. But the original tithe was thought to be of just grain, wine, and oil, olive oil. Those 3 types of the of agricultural produce, and not apricots and all sorts of other fruits and vegetables, and certainly not, I would add, the spices. Now, with time, and including today in modern Orthodox practice, tithing still occurs. That it is set aside, but something's done. It's set aside as performing the commandment, but not eaten by Levites anymore, but still set aside. And today, at least in Israel, spices are very much tithed. But at the time, that was a dispute, a debate amongst the rabbis, what needs to be tithed. And Jesus is quoted as going for here, saying, dudes, get a life. I mean, it's not about exactly, do you have to, there's a midrashic tradition that says, I think Esau, right? Esau, of Jacob and Esau, that he was trying to find favor in his father's eyes by tithing salt. And nobody says you tithe salt, right? It's this uber chokhmah, right? This over being a righteous person.
I mean, among Christians in particular, let's look at the Roman Catholic tradition. One of the things that we have is called the sin of scrupulosity.
Ooh,
And
love
so
that word.
that means that you are trying so hard to do everything right that you've tied up your life and your spirituality with exactly this thing of, and so I was talking to some monks recently, and they were talking about how when their brothers actually heard confessions from the nuns, there was a certain amount of conversation amongst the guys, not about what they actually had to say in their confessions, but the level of tininess that they felt that they had to go to confession, but they hadn't really done much of anything. So they had all these tiny little things that they were so upset about having done that it was really hard for the brothers, the fathers, to listen to, because this scrupulosity. The problem with it is all of that scrupulosity has the effect of framing everything in your spirituality from a negative perspective, as opposed to from a joyful and gracious perspective. So
I will say that when one of our daughters was going to an Orthodox school in the years we lived in Israel, all of our daughters grew up in Israel. And at one point, Sasha and I realized that she was learning more about what, in fact, she was only learning what not to do on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, but not what to do, or not as much to do. What are the positive aspects? And there is a tendency among certain religiosity to go in that direction, so much so that if you want to eat kosher, you know that it's not just swine and cows that are not slaughtered properly, and milk and meat, or blood from the meat. That's part of it, but it's also you can't eat insects other than grasshoppers. So gnats are not kosher. So you could be very careful, as Jesus is quoted as saying here. I mean, really, to strain your gnat out of your water to get in, and yet you're sitting down to a big camel burger. Camels are not kosher, that kind of thing, or a camel cheeseburger. Okay.
I wish I was preaching soon. I could try to work this camel burger into the sermon.
You know what? Please, and if you remember to quote me, that's fine, but don't worry about it. Okay, because these are important things. I understand. So this is an acquaintance of yours. Why don't you read what she has to say?
Well, she is one of the commentators from a group called workingpreachers.org. And this was for her commentary a few years ago when this lesson popped up. And so Sharon Ring, as a resident of Washington, D.C., I recognize political rhetoric, caricatures, and trash talk when I hear them. And I hear them loud and clear in Matthew. Now, the interesting thing to me was that same yesterday, I was actually talking to someone and I mentioned this Sharon Ring, and he said, oh, when she got her master's of divinity, she was my student. And he said, she's right on in this interpretation, because he was a New Testament professor. So I was really very interesting to hear this, because to me, it takes this passage out of the realm of religion and into the realm of religious politics.
Right.
It's an insider's game, not a way of promoting your faith to others outside, but a way of finding power and prominence within your faith.
This was one of the points we were making 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, whenever we last met. And this is, I guess, what we're trying to say is that in the New Testament context, this is not particularly anti-Jewish. And if it is phrased as anti-Pharisean, well, that's how the rhetoric went in those days. That's how it went. And what we're hearing from Professor Ring and from you and from others is that, yeah, and we recognize that. We recognize that this is not, can I go so far to say these are not holy words as some people would take them. They're not as holy as words in their simple meaning.
Right. They're not. And I think at the heart of it, they are not the kind of, the difficulty with them is that people like Pastor Stephen, who are quoting them today, are quoting them without any of our conversation, without any of our sense of complexity or layers of meaning or insiders and outsiders. That's someone who is reading it with a sense that I know everything I need to know to understand this word when I see it. So whatever I think it means is what it means. And for those people who are often trying to justify themselves and find a place for themselves in the world, attacking somebody else is one of the easiest ways to do it. And that's where the real sense of anti-Semitism comes out from for centuries. Anybody that was confronted with something like this found that these passages in the way we're talking about them were an easy vehicle to beat and harm the Jews.
And that's an important point. We're not trying to gloss over the fact that these are parts of scripture that have been misused, we would say, in the past, but we're trying to put them into their historical perspective when they were written, at least around the time when they were written. And for that, we're going to bring now a few rabbinic traditions that speak to the same thing that Jesus is quoted as speaking to here in the gospel according to Matthew. That is a self-criticism of the world, the structures, the political, religious, educational structures in which Jesus was reacting and living. In other words, Jesus is not saying anything that we don't find in rabbinic literature, really. But before that, I also want to say that we Jews as well have our own things to be embarrassed about. When I was at a gathering of Christians and Jews many years ago in Sweden, we were asked to go back to our congregations, each of us, and to our communities, and look at the liturgy. It's not just those passages in the Catholic liturgy that were found to be terribly anti-Semitic about salvation for Jews, redemption for Jews, those that were changed in the 60s and those that remained. It's about all of us have that kind of stuff in our background. And I came back to the community in Stockholm and was going to talk about Aleinu. Now, at the time, I had kind of been under the impression, I guess I got it when I was in Orthodox educational institutions, that Aleinu was a prayer already, an ancient prayer from biblical times. And since then, I kind of looked into it. Aleinu, the earliest mention of it is, I think, is in the 10th century. But it's still thought to be earlier than that, but certainly not biblical, and doesn't seem to be rabbinic as well. So let's say sometime in the second half of the first millennium. So we're taking it, we're going way beyond our time frame of New Testament literature, but the idea is here, and the ideas can be found in biblical literature. And Aleinu is the prayer that one says in all parts of Judaism, all movements, all streams of Judaism, says at the end of a prayer, morning, evening, afternoon. But this is the traditional wording, as is still said today in many Orthodox synagogues. It is upon us to praise the Lord of all. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. To bestow greatness to the molder of creation. For God did not make us as the nations of the lands, and God did not establish us like the families of the earth. For God did not assign our portion as theirs, and our lot like all the multitudes. For they bowed down to vanity and emptiness, in Hebrew, lehevel varik, based on the verse in Isaiah, and pray to a God that saves not, the El Lo Yoshia, also based on Isaiah. And we bow before the King of all kings, the Holy One, blessed, the blessed Holy One. Now, the line that is in italics here, the penultimate section, is in italics because it had been taken out of the prayer book by the Christian censorship, the medieval censorship, and only came back in printed versions towards the end of the 20th century, although still preserved in certain circles. There's also a custom which is still preserved in certain circles today, unfortunately, but goes back at least to the 17th century, of before you say, for they bow down to vanity and emptiness, you spit a little bit off to the side. And that is because of maybe on purpose, the word rik means emptiness, bow to vanity, emptiness, but ruk is spittle in Hebrew. So that's kind of the reason for doing it, but we understand that the reason is greater than that. In other words, we have what to be embarrassed about in our tradition. The way that many of us got around it is to totally, redo the wording. Or in the case of Or Hamidbar, we just leave out those lines and just leave it on the positive aspect. But now we get into some of the rabbinic literature as to so here we have from the tractate of Nidarim, that is ostensibly it deals with the issue of vows, what you promise to do, what you vow to do, to love the Lord your God, to listen to God's voice, and to cleave to God, says Deuteronomy. The verse indicates that a person should not say, I will read the written Torah, that is Torah Shebaal Peh, the Torah of the rabbis, the written, the Torah Shebichtav, the written law, as in the 5 books of Moses, so that they will call me a sage. I will study Mishnah, that is the first collection of oral traditions of the rabbis, edited around the year 200 CE. I will study the Mishnah so they will call me a rabbi. I will review my studies so that I will be an elder and will sit in the academy. Those are not reasons, right? You don't go get a PhD because they'll call you doctor, but rather you learn out of love, says the Talmud, as the verse states, to love the Lord your God. And the honor will eventually come on its own accord. As it is stated, bind them upon your fingers, write them on the tablet of your heart in the book of Proverbs. And it states also in Proverbs, its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. And it states, it is a tree of life for those who grasp it. Happy is everyone who holds it fast. Eitz chaim hi lemachazikim ba, as we sing at the end of the Torah service, those who are familiar with the liturgy of the synagogue. In other words, the same message, although I would say edited in a fashion which is a bit more positive, right?
Yes.
Don't do it for that reason. But it goes on, Rabbi Eliezer Bar Tzadok says, do things for the sake of their performance. That is, in the name of what you're doing, not for any ulterior motive, and speak words of Torah for their own sake. Do not make them a crown with which to be glorified, and do not make them as a cordom, dolabra in Greek, with which to hoe, right? Don't use your words, don't weaponize your words. That's another way of saying it. Do not use Torah study as a means to earning a livelihood. Again, a more pleasant way of saying than perhaps Jesus is quoted, but it gets a little messier here. Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Banaha, how should the garment of a Torah scholar worn under his clothes be fashioned? That is the one that has the fringes. He replied, he can wear any garment long enough that his flesh is not visible from beneath it. Whatever it is, it needs to be modest. Rabbi Yochanan asked, how should the cloak of a Torah scholar be fashioned? He replied, he can wear any garment long enough that a handbreadth of his garment worn under his clothes is not visible from beneath it. Without trying to go into detail exactly to how the costume worked, in other words, it's saying the clothes are not about how beautiful they are and stating what your level is in society, where you are in the hierarchy, social hierarchy. It's about modesty. Whatever the clothes are should preserve the modesty of. That is here the physical modesty, but what's meant, of course, is the overall modesty of a religious leader or educational leader. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, with regard to anyone who glorifies himself by wearing a garment of the style worn by a Torah scholar, but in reality he is not a Torah scholar, he will not be brought within the boundary of the Holy One in the world to come. In other words, don't try to pretend to wear the clothes of a Torah scholar if you're not a Torah scholar. Now, this is not a parallel to what Jesus is quoted as saying in the Gospel according to Matthew, but it does give the background. And also, I have to say, with all integrity, academic honesty or integrity, that these are sources from quite a bit later. They're from the end of the second, beginning of the 3rd century, maybe mostly the 3rd century, and not edited until the 5th or the 6th century. But still, the idea of clothing and how it speaks that what do we say? The clothes makes a man. What's the expression?
Yeah.
Right. That is certainly out there, and I would say it's out there today as well. And let's look at one more. On the day that they removed Rabban Gamliel from his position, we're a bit earlier, and appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in his place, that is at the head of the academy, there was also a fundamental change in the general approach of the study hall, as they dismissed the guard at the door and permission was granted to the students to enter. Because before that, we have a certain amount of stories. Not everybody could get it. Only a limited amount of people could get in. They had to pass an exam. In some cases, they had to pay money. There's a story of Hillel, the famous Hillel, who was on the roof and almost froze to death because he was listening to the words of the rabbinic debate from the hole in the ceiling, the chimney. Instead of Rabban Gamliel's selective approach that asserted that the students must be screened before accepting them into the study hall, the new approach asserted that anyone who seeks to study should be given opportunity to do so. As Rabban Gamliel would proclaim and say, any student whose inside, that is his thoughts and his feelings, are not like his outside, that is how he acts, his conduct, and I would add his clothes, right, will not enter the study hall. In other words, integrity. And I bring this, Father Andrew, as a suggestion as to how we might process. Remember, our title of our series is From Holiness to Hatred and Back Again. How do we redeem, all of us, both Christians and Jews and anybody else who comes to the table, a text that has been misused because it was convenient to misuse in hate? How might we bring it back to a discussion of, so what is education? What is religious organization?
I mean, I think that's a great conversation to have, because in so many ways, the practice of spiritual direction and various spiritual authors in Christianity and in other faiths all are harking back to, just like the Rabbi Gamaliel was saying, that your insides need to match your outsides, and how to really focus on what the insides are and let them lead us to what the outside expressions are, rather than focus on making sure all the outsides are correct. And it begins with a humility. It begins with a humility, and to me, that then leads to generosity and gratitude as the components of it. Where these others are looking at others to denigrate and put them down, seem to be absent any sense of gratitude, generosity.
I would say humility also can lead to equality, to a more equitable social situation. I'm thinking now of perhaps re-listening to Jesus, according to Matthew, is saying, the way it's set up now for spreading wisdom and spreading a closeness to God in this hierarchical state, as it is, at least with the Pharisees, all the more so, by the way, I would say with the Sadducees, what we know about the Sadducees and the priestly structure in the temple, there's a question of equality here. And the lack of humility tends for people to look at, you see it in organizations, right? The ones who give the money, the ones whose parents, the multi-generational kind of thing, those dynamics, we have both seen it more than we'd like. But that leads us to the last paragraph of what I'd like us perhaps to be like our kind of redemptive or restorative passage that we read today from the Talmud again. On that day, this is in at the end of that story about Rabbi Gamliel, who was replaced. On that day, several benches were added to the study hall to accommodate the numerous students. Right? The gates were open. More people could go to college, could go to high school, could go to any kind of seminar. The more people could get into, because more benches were added because of a call, I think, or a new way of thinking of the rabbinic elite in a more humble way. And yet, when he saw the tremendous growth in the numbers of students, right? He's retired, right? You can imagine, right? You, of course, can imagine.
Oh, yes.
Right? What
I'm
happens when
getting
you
into that,
retire?
yes.
Rabbi Gamliel was disheartened. He said, perhaps, chas v'shalom, heaven forbid, I prevented Israel from engaging in Torah study. He felt bad, right? Maybe this is wrong. And yet, there are always those that are going to say, no, you were right. They showed him in his dream white jugs filled with ashes, alluding to the fact that the additional students were worthless idlers. The complexity of what we're talking about here. We may talk, as Jesus did, about reforming society, about humility leading to equality when it comes to education, when it comes to healing, when it comes to a closeness to God, all the things that we learn from especially from the Gospels. And yet, there's always going to be a voice that says, in this case, it's the editor of the Talmud who adds this, that he got a dream saying, no, you were right to be elitist. The others are worth, but that is, I think, the danger. That's the chance that I think we've got to take, right?
There was a phrase that came up when we were talking about this, about the majoring in the minors. And it seems like that is something that I know that the Christian faith lives with all the time, and it ebbs and flows, that we get so caught up in the dill and the cumin tithing that we miss out on the other things. But in every generation, we have folks who are reminding us how to turn ourselves back to that. There are prophets who call us to that humility, call us to the things that are welcoming, call us to the idea that the gate, while maybe narrow, is incredibly open for an incredibly long time, so that people can get in, even though they may have to try and contort themselves, perhaps, as opposed to something that says, we only want these people, the people who look, act, talk like me, to get in. We want everyone to participate fully in that love and generosity that we experience from God.
Thank you. And we want to ask you, are there any comments or questions that you'd like to be part of this conversation in a more active way? Please go ahead and write them in the chat box or in the Q&A. I don't know which one we're using. That's the challenge, I think, of the webinar format, is that it's hard for us to see the faces of the people with whom we're talking, all the more so when we share a screen with a PowerPoint presentation. So maybe we'll think about that for the future, but okay then. Well, we do, both of us, invite each of you, any of you, to write us an email, either through Kevin at the Jewish Federation, as many of you did after our last time, with questions, with comments. These are beginnings of conversations. They're not conversations in themselves. They really aren't. And we hope to see you in the future, when I'll be talking with Father Green and with other kinds of other scholars. And I'm distracted.
We have a question. Is an exaggeration part of the way of teaching in the 1st century CE?
Indeed.
Yeah, I would say not just in the 1st century CE. We saw that a few weeks ago as well. It's hyperbole. As we saw from, we've got a problem with the sound. Sorry. As we saw from from Professor Ring, that it's not just in the 1st century CE.
That's
I think
right.
we see that around us as well, right? This hyperbole, this rhetoric, which can be very dangerous.
I mean, we're seeing right now that if you look at social media, the things in social media that are the most productive are the things that are most hyperbolic, the things that don't just talk about the reality of violence, but exalt and build on that violence. And that's the thing that gets likes, that's the thing that gets responses. And so hyperbole is perhaps a real danger. And where I've heard it work best is when one uses the hyperbole about themselves and uses that expansive and over-the-top language to put myself back into a place of humility as a result of coming face to face with this over-the-top kind of language.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Anyone else?
Well, thank you both, and thank you everybody for attending. Again, this was recorded, which will be emailed out to all registrants shortly after this. And if you have future questions, I'd be happy to also include the email contacts for these two gentlemen who might be able to give you a little better theological answer than I might. But if you have any Jewish Federation related questions, please email me at kevin.geiser@jfedps.org. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.